At the heart of Marcel Plaza, a security guard made the mistake of forgetting who he was speaking to. In front of cameras, strangers, and quiet gasps, he disrespected Big Shaq's wife like she didn't belong. There was no shouting, no scene, just the weight of her silence. Sharp, composed, undeniable. Big Shaq stood back, knowing some storms don't come with thunder. Moments later, the system that gave him authority folded without a fight. Because Big Shaq's wife didn't argue, she fired him without saying a single word. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun poured over the city like melted gold, steady and slow, lighting up glass towers and bouncing off high-end windshields. Sunday had its own rhythm in the upscale district of Linwood Grove. Soft jazz bleeding from rooftop cafes, small dogs in tailored sweaters, couples gliding through boutique storefronts, and money moving quietly behind every smile. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to the world, just Shaq to those who mattered, stepped out of the matte black SUV, holding the door for his wife, Ariel. She moved with a grace that didn't seek attention, but always drew it. Not just beauty, presence. Her heels clicked against polished stone like a metronome that people unconsciously adjusted themselves to. She wore cream and caramel tones, subtle but striking, like she knew every inch of the space was watching, and didn't mind a bit. Shaq towered next to her, but never overshadowed her. He wasn't dressed to impress. He never was. That was the thing about Shaq. He had the kind of wealth that didn't need to scream. A clean navy crewneck, jeans that fit just right, and a Rolex that barely peeked from his sleeve. He wore comfort like a crown. The valet gave a small nod, recognizing them. The staff at Marcel Plaza, a haven for the elite, had learned to respect without fawning. It was a place where privacy was currency, and dignity was expected. But today, something in the air felt skewed, like a picture frame slightly tilted on a pristine wall. The security guard at the main arch, Damon Riker, was a new face. Lean, buzz-cut, the kind of man who stood just a little too squarely, chest puffed not with pride but with something more brittle. He looked like he lifted weights, not for strength, but for control. He saw Ariel first. Then his gaze slid to Shaq, registered recognition, and returned to her, longer this time. The moment passed fast, almost invisible. But tension, like static, didn't need time. It just needed presence. Ariel felt it. So did Shaq. They didn't say a word to each other, just kept walking. As they reached the entrance, Damon stepped forward, not too fast, just enough to interject their rhythm. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, eyes fixed on Ariel. No smile, no warmth, not even professionalism, just control. Shaq paused, a half step behind his wife. He didn't interrupt, didn't step in. He watched, measured. "May I see your ID?" Damon added. Ariel blinked, the kind of blink that didn't mean confusion. It meant calculation. She wasn't carrying a purse. She didn't need to in this plaza. She'd been here hundreds of times. Everyone knew her. Shaq's jaw moved slightly. "Just once. We need to make sure all guests are registered," Damon added, voice flat. She said nothing, just stared. Not defiant, not aggressive. Present. Her silence wasn't passive. It was poised. From a corner cafe, someone paused their spoon midair. A store clerk across the walkway tilted her head. A couple at the valet looked up. The moment had stretched thin, and it hadn't even snapped yet. Shaq stepped forward slowly. His presence did most of the talking. He didn't need to raise his voice. "She's with me." Damon's expression didn't shift, but something flickered behind his eyes. He nodded, mechanically, and just like that, the moment passed. Or it seemed to. They walked in. Ariel didn't look back. Neither did Shaq, but the silence they left behind said more than any confrontation could have. Inside the plaza, air conditioning greeted them like sanctuary. The storefronts sparkled, the scent of French roast and Italian leather, weaving through clean marble hallways. Everything resumed its rhythm, but something inside Shaq hadn't. He knew that kind of look. He'd felt it before fame, and after, at airports, at charity events, even once backstage, at a speaking engagement. The look that didn't see you as human, just as something else, something to evaluate, something to contain. He had been many things in his life. A soldier's son, an NBA legend, a businessman, a DJ, a speaker, a friend. But in moments like these, None of it mattered. In moments like these, you were just a target someone had already decided didn't belong. They stopped in a boutique Ariel loved. Maison Thorn. The manager rushed over, cheerful, respectful, no mention of what had just happened outside. That was how these places worked. Clean, curated, and always pretending the world outside didn't seep in. But Shaq's mind stayed at that archway. The way Damon's voice had no curiosity, no professionalism, just a tone reserved for confrontation, or maybe suspicion. He remembered something Lucille told him when he was 13, after a cop followed them out of a grocery store. They'll never say it with words, baby, but they'll say it with their eyes, and sometimes that's louder. Later that afternoon, they sat at Ravel, the plaza's rooftop cafe. Ariel sipped sparkling water, eyes scanning the city like it was an unfinished painting. Shaq watched her. How quiet she was, but not distant, just reflective. I've seen that look before, he finally said, his voice low. She nodded once. So have I. They didn't need more words. Ariel picked up her phone, sent a message, no emotion on her face. Just intent. Not anger, not revenge, just resolution. Shaq didn't ask who she messaged. He trusted her moves more than his own impulses. He looked out over the plaza below. People moved like chess pieces, carefully styled and unaware of the game around them. But he saw it, felt it, and he knew this wasn't over. Not because he wanted a fight, but because silence too can be a weapon. Back down by the main arch, Damon stood in place, eyes scanning, posture proud. But beneath the crisp uniform and the rehearsed authority, something trembled. He didn't know it yet. But the day had shifted. This Sunday wasn't silent. It had started with sunlight, smiles and soft footsteps. But now, beneath the heat, something colder stirred. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his massive hands folded, his frame relaxed but his mind sharp. He wouldn't raise his voice. He wouldn't make a scene. But something had begun. And Damon Riker had no idea what kind of quiet he had stepped into. Damon Riker wore his uniform like armor, but not the kind meant for protection. His posture wasn't about duty. It was about dominance. There was something too rigid in the way he stood. Something too eager in how he reached for control. His badge was polished. His boots shined. But his gaze was what gave him away. Sharp, narrow, and searching, not for threats but for something to push against. Something to make small. From the moment Ariel stepped out of the SUV, Damon's body shifted like a machine, locking into place. He'd been briefed on high-profile guests. Sure, Shaquille O'Neal was impossible to miss. But his attention never really landed on the man, the way it should have. It paused instead on the woman, and not out of curiosity or professionalism. No, Damon's stare had another language. One Ariel had been fluent in her whole life. It started subtle. Too subtle for most to notice. A delay in opening the gate. A scan up and down her frame, not admiring, but inspecting, like she needed to pass some invisible test he hadn't prepared anyone else for, like she didn't belong here, unless he said she did. Shaq stood beside her, silent but alert. He'd felt this energy before. It was the kind of moment that started normal, almost boring, but then started to hum with something electric, something that told you to brace for what was coming. Ariel remained composed, her chin high, her eyes locked on Damon, like she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever game he was trying to play. Damon took a step forward. His hand hovered near his radio, not touching it, just reminding everyone it was there. "Ma'am," he said, firm but flat, "I'm going to need to see your ID." He said it like a question he'd already decided the answer to. Like he wanted the denial. Like he wanted the resistance, so he could pounce. Ariel didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She simply blinked, slow and deliberate. No purse in hand. She wasn't carrying one today. She didn't need to. Her face, her presence, everything about her was its own form of ID in this place. Shaq remained still, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. But his silence wasn't passive. It was watching and recording. Damon ignored Shaq completely, though the man's shadow nearly engulfed him. That wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. And that made it louder than anything he could have said. The plaza had started to take notice. A couple nearby slowed their steps. A concierge from the adjacent jewelry store paused mid-greeting to glance over. A barista, hidden behind a window of layered cakes and imported espresso beans, narrowed her eyes. The silence thickened. Damon leaned into it. "Security checks are standard for all guests, ma'am," he said. "You're not listed in our system." The words were clean professional on the surface. But his tone? It carried the grit of something personal. Like she'd offended him just by existing too confidently, too completely, in a space he decided she didn't earn. Ariel said nothing. She wasn't going to give him the show. She wasn't going to offer anger or even explanation. She simply turned slightly, placing her weight onto her back foot, eyes still locked on Damon like he was a student interrupting a masterclass. Behind her, Shaq's shoulders rose slowly. Not in aggression, in control. He shifted one step forward, just enough to force Damon's eyes upward. "She's not in the system," Shaq said calmly. "Because she doesn't need to be. She built the system." It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact. Ariel had worked with Marcel Plaza's executive board years ago, developing their VIP access protocol. Her fingerprint was in the foundation. Damon either didn't know or didn't care. Damon's face remained stiff. He didn't apologize. He didn't back down. He looked at Shaq with that same edge in his stare. The kind that didn't see a person, just a problem. "I wasn't informed," he said coolly, as if the failure was theirs, not his. There was no yelling, no name-calling, just that unmistakable air of dismissal. And in some ways, that was worse. The way Damon looked through Ariel like she was a forgery, like she needed permission to be in her own skin in that place. More eyes were on them now. Some curious, some uncomfortable, some pretending not to see, but not really succeeding. Damon didn't care. He thrived on the attention. He'd found his moment and leaned in with the arrogance of someone who believed his uniform could protect him from consequences. Shaq, on the other hand, didn't move. His expression didn't change, but the weight in his presence shifted. He knew this wasn't the moment to react. It was the moment to remember, because sometimes, it's the silence that burns longer than the noise. Ariel finally turned toward the entrance. She walked past Damon, like he was glass, transparent and fragile, and in that small motion, she won the moment. Not because he let her pass, but because she chose not to crumble, because she made the insult obvious without touching it. Damon didn't call after her. He didn't try to stop them again, but his jaw tightened, his chest puffed, not in pride but in frustration. The doors closed behind them, and inside the cooled elegance of the plaza, the world seemed to resume its rehearsed rhythm. But Shaq knew better. He knew this wasn't over. That man, Damon, wasn't just a rogue employee. He was a product of something larger, a rot that dressed itself in policies and procedures, a system that spoke in codes, in ID checks, in phrases like standard security measure. Back at the entrance, Damon pulled out his radio and whispered something into it. Not loud enough to draw attention, but enough to feel important, enough to look like he had control. But inside, Shaq and Ariel moved with a different kind of authority. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that lets silence hang until it becomes undeniable. What Damon hadn't realized yet was that he'd already lost. Not just the moment, but the narrative. Because the very crowd that watched him had absorbed something else entirely. They'd seen Ariel hold her dignity like a shield. They'd seen a man built like a fortress choose restraint over fire, and they'd felt the tremor left behind. Ariel didn't speak of the incident again that day. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't avoidance. It was orchestration. And Shaq, despite every muscle in his body wanting to turn back and tear the smugness from Damon's face, chose instead to wait, to let the truth land when it would hit hardest. He'd learned a long time ago that the world didn't always need another loud man. Sometimes, it needed a quiet storm. And Damon Riker had just stepped into the eye of it. There was something heavier than humiliation that clung to Shaq's skin as he sat in the corner of the rooftop cafe. The city pulsed in the distance, its skyline like a silent orchestra of steel and stories. But up here things felt still. Too still. Not peaceful. Pressurized. Ariel sat across from him, one hand cupping her glass, eyes focused somewhere beyond the edge of the terrace. She hadn't spoken about what happened at the entrance. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. Some things weren't meant to be unpacked in real time. Some things needed to be absorbed, then dissected strategically. She was doing that now, quiet, calculating, unshaken. Shaq, though, was still carrying it. But not in the way people expected him to. He didn't lash out. He didn't storm back down to confront Damon, or demand answers from management. That would have been too easy. Too expected. Especially for a man like him. A man the world already saw as a walking reaction. The sheer size of him always preceded the soul. To most he was still Big Shaq, a name that, while iconic, sometimes erased the person behind the figure. He leaned back in his chair, his massive hands folded in front of him. Not in prayer, not in tension, just in stillness. But inside, the memory played on repeat. Damon's tone. The strategic disrespect. The crowd's half-interest, half-apathy. The familiarity of it all. And just like that, he was 12 years old again. The sidewalks of Newark had been cracked then, and so had the world. He remembered the first time someone flinched when he walked too close. Not because he'd done anything. Not because he'd even spoken. Just because he was. A shadow too large. A boy too big. A presence they hadn't yet found a polite way to categorize. Lucille had held his hand that day, not just out of motherly instinct, but out of strategy. She'd known the world would misread her son long before he ever opened his mouth. "You're not allowed to make the first move," she told him once, after a teacher called home to report that he'd raised his voice. "Not because you're wrong, but because they already believe you are." That lesson had stuck. Not because he feared consequence, but because he understood optics, and power, and how sometimes, real power comes in not doing what they expect you to. College had been worse in some ways. Fame didn't erase perception, it only intensified the spotlight. During a post-game press conference, his sophomore year, a sports reporter, trying to be funny, called him a beast in human form. The room laughed. Shaq didn't. He remembered feeling like his skin had been turned inside out. Remembered looking at his coach, waiting for someone to correct it. No one did. He'd smiled, gave a cool answer, even threw in a joke to match the room's temperature. But that smile had burned. Because he knew what they saw wasn't a student-athlete, or a teammate, or a leader. They saw a spectacle, a body, a force to be entertained but never understood. The same energy lived in Damon Riker's eyes, a cold certainty that said, "You may have money, you may have fame, but I get to decide if you're allowed in the room today." Shaq exhaled slowly, bringing himself back to the rooftop, to the now. The wind stirred slightly, brushing against his shoulders like it, too, was trying to ease the pressure. Ariel finally turned toward him, not with concern, but with clarity. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't need to. She knew the silence he was sitting in. She'd sat in it too. "Let it marinate," she said, barely above a whisper. "It'll cook better that way." Shaq nodded once. No words exchanged, but 1,000 understood. He wasn't numb. He was waiting. There's a difference. The experience had confirmed something for him. Something he'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to confront. That Damon hadn't been acting alone. Not really. The man might have delivered the blow, but the system had handed him the weapon. It had trained him to believe that his uniform was justification enough. That suspicion was a skill. That respect was optional. Especially when the subject wore skin like Shaq's, or Ariel's. And maybe that was what haunted Shaq the most. Not the disrespect but the design behind it. He thought back to Lucille's hands, always working. Whether it was patching a jacket, stirring a pot, or gripping his shoulders too tight during a life lesson, she had a way of grounding him without ever lowering her own gravity. "Don't give them your fire, son," she'd say. "Give them your mirror. Let them see themselves burning." He hadn't fully understood it back then. But now, in his 40s, watching this world turn slower for some, and faster for others, he knew exactly what she meant. That's why he hadn't shouted, why he hadn't stormed. Because Damon's actions weren't the main event. They were a symptom. And if you spend your energy treating symptoms, you never cure the disease. Still, that didn't mean doing nothing. Shaq reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. Not to text Ariel, she was already moving in her own quiet ways. Not to call management too low on the chain, but to open a folder he kept for moments like this. Inside were names, stories, photos, security guards, executives, journalists, athletes, students, all black, all having experienced versions of what he and Ariel just did. Only they didn't have millions, or headlines, or audiences. They had bruises on their reputations, their careers, their sense of place in a country that claimed to be past all this. Shaq had been funding a project quietly for 3 years. A mentorship initiative for young black professionals in fields where presence alone was controversial. Security, policing, corporate HR, finance. His goal wasn't just representation, it was reconstruction. He added a note to the file. Marcel Plaza incident, Riker. Potential case study. Contact DEI liaison. Schedule board review. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even personal. It was a response, one that would ripple longer than a confrontation. He put the phone away, looking back at Ariel, who gave him a small, knowing smile. She didn't need to ask what he'd done. She trusted that he was building the counterweight to the moment they'd just lived. Down below, in the clean, curated halls of Marcel Plaza, people returned to their champagne shopping and curated brunches, but even they, whether consciously or not, felt the change, that something had shifted, that silence had pressed in the air like humidity before a storm. Damon Riker had already returned to his post, standing tall, still wearing his uniform like it made him untouchable. But the truth was, he was already marked, not by vengeance, but by accountability. And accountability had a longer memory than anger ever did. Shaq sat back, one leg crossed over the other, his frame relaxed once again. But inside he was not still. He was turning gears, drawing lines, plotting truth. He had learned, over and over, that restraint wasn't weakness. It was legacy, a discipline passed down from Lucille, from history, from every ancestor who'd ever had to smile through clenched teeth and survive another day just to build a better one. And now it was Shaq's turn to pass that lesson forward. Not with noise, but with weight, the kind that doesn't just watch, but shapes the way the world watches back. Power shift hinted. Emotional gravity. Building suspense. The air inside the plaza was cooler, calmer, but Ariel carried the heat of that entrance with her like it had sewn itself into her skin. She walked through the luxury corridors without missing a step, her heels clicking against marble like punctuation marks in a story only she knew the ending to. Shaq walked beside her, large and steady, but this chapter wasn't about him. Not yet. This part belonged to her, the woman who hadn't blinked when a man in uniform tried to shrink her. The silence between them wasn't tension. It was calculation. Ariel's mind moved like a strategist's. Every breath measured. Every movement a conscious decision. She didn't believe in overreacting. She believed in correcting. And that took precision, not volume. The moment Damon Riker stepped in front of her, she'd made a decision. Not about what to say, but about what to do later. And later had now arrived. They exited through the east atrium, bypassing the valet line and its mechanical civility. Shaq didn't ask where they were going. He simply followed. That was the nature of their bond. Silent alignment. He knew her steps meant something. He knew they weren't headed to a reaction. They were headed toward an outcome. Ariel reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with a single name, Lennox Vale. She tapped once. The line rang only once. Vale, a voice answered, sharp, clipped, and deeply familiar. I need a needle to the vein, Ariel said. There was a pause, not of hesitation, but recognition. Tell me where to stick it, Lennox replied. She hung up without another word. Ariel never explained herself twice to people who already understood how she operated. Shaq glanced at her. Lennox? Ariel nodded. He owes me. Lennox Vale wasn't a friend in the casual sense. He wasn't someone you called for birthdays or shared vacation photos with. He was a fixer, but not the Hollywood kind with bleach-white smiles and disposable secrets. Lennox was corporate Steve, quiet, surgical, and embedded in the back hallways of boardrooms and billionaire disputes. His weapon wasn't blackmail or scandal. It was access to records, to policy, to decision-makers who wore tailored suits and believed in quiet resolution. And he worked for her. Not through contract, through debt. Years ago, Ariel had pulled Lennox out of a PR disaster that would have drowned him. A scandal involving a CEO, falsified documents, and one misinterpreted press release that nearly imploded a Fortune 100 firm. Ariel had rewritten the narrative cleaned it so thoroughly the stock price had actually risen. He never forgot. And now she was collecting. They reached the car. The driver opened the door, but Ariel paused just before stepping in. Her gaze drifted back to the building, not with resentment, not with anger, with strategy. That look she gave the marble walls and glass archways was the same one she'd given Damon, one of evaluation, not vengeance. She wasn't interested in punishing people. She was interested in removing problems. Inside the car, she opened her tablet and began scrolling. Names, titles, departments, She knew Marcel Plaza wasn't just a shopping haven. It was a tax shield, a corporate asset buried beneath real estate LLCs and offshore holdings. But all assets had vulnerabilities, and all public-facing enterprises had brand reputations. That was where she would strike. But first, Damon. Not through confrontation, through elimination. She sent Lennox a short list: personnel files, Damon Riker, 2 internal training footage, last 90 days, 3 security contract vendor, list of board members,
4. Incident logs. Filter female BIPOC patrons.
5 social media cross-match, alt profiles, affiliations, 6 HR complaints, last 18 months, 7 any sealed settlements, whistleblower tags. She didn't hit send immediately. She stared at it, considered it, then added one last line: 8 timestamped edits on security feeds. Today, 11:42 a.m. Then she sent it. Shaq watched her without interrupting. There was no need to ask what she was doing. He recognized the look in her eyes, the same look she had when negotiating contracts, rewriting brand identities, or walking into rooms where she was expected to just look pretty. She didn't just walk through doors, she rearranged them. For Ariel, silence was never about passivity. It was leverage. The more underestimated she was, the easier it became to move behind the curtain and shift the stage. And Damon, whether he knew it or not, had handed her the entire theater. The car glided down Fifth Avenue, passing curated storefronts and well-placed palms. But Ariel wasn't looking outside. She was 5 steps ahead already. She was thinking about the board meeting she would force into being without ever requesting it, about the press whisper she'd plant through Lennox's contact at the Tribune, about the documentary segment she was helping develop, one about racial profiling in upscale communities. She could adjust the script, add a new angle, call it what they don't show you in the security footage. The moment Damon tried to minimize her, he'd accidentally expanded her reach.
Back in the plaza, Damon stood at his post like nothing had happened. But the tension in his jaw was new. He'd seen Ariel's face when she left. Something in him understood he hadn't just made a mistake. He'd triggered a response that wouldn't come in shouting or lawsuits. It would come in silence. In small doors that stopped opening for him. In meetings that slowly excluded his name. In management suddenly remembering policies they'd long ignored.
And when that happened, there'd be no memo, no confrontation, just absence. Ariel's kind of power didn't knock. It erased. She closed her tablet as they pulled into the underground garage of their high-rise. The lights above glowed soft and golden, like the warmth hadn't yet caught up with what the day had done to her. Shaq placed a hand on her lower back as they stepped out, not for reassurance, but acknowledgement. "I don't know how you do that," he said. She smiled faintly. "Do what?" "Hold your fire, turn it into calculus." "I don't burn bridges," she said. "I pave over them." Upstairs, their penthouse was quiet, filled with evening shadows and the low hum of classical piano from the sound system. Ariel poured herself a glass of water, took one sip, then placed the glass down without finishing it. She stood at the window, looking out at the horizon. There was no satisfaction in her face, no revenge glow, just focus, resolve, because she knew the world didn't need another screaming match. It needed dismantling, one structure at a time, and Damon Riker had just become her next blueprint. In the belly of a converted loft in Tribeca, surrounded by walls that doubled as server stations and soundproof insulation, Kendricks Voss read through code like most men read scripture. 2 monitors, a phone, and silence. His ritual of uncovering truth in a world built on carefully engineered lies. The only light came from his screens, casting harsh blue against his eyes, which never blinked at what they saw. He wasn't a man who advertised his services. You didn't find Kendricks in directories or on LinkedIn. You were given his name in whispers, handed like a key to a locked door that could be opened only once. He had worked for politicians, private equity firms, and billionaires whose scandals never reached the news cycle. But of all the people he had served, Ariel was the only one he'd ever called back without being paid to. So when her message arrived that evening, just one line, "Time to clean house," he didn't ask questions. He just leaned forward and started typing. The first thing he did was pull Damon Riker's employment file. The plaza's vendor security system was predictable. Passwords disguised as corporate acronyms, VPNs with weak redundancy, cloud backups that weren't even encrypted. Within 20 minutes, Kendricks had Damon's full profile on his second monitor. 5-year history with a third-party firm called Sentry Corp. 2 prior complaints filed and quietly dismissed. A gap in employment marked as private leave. And a personnel note tagged observe, but don't engage. That last part made Kendricks pause. Observe what? Don't engage with whom? He flagged it and kept digging. Next came the social footprint. And that's where things got louder. Damon's public profile was polished, clean timeline, professional group photos, a couple of barbecue shots, and a bio that read proud to serve and protect the standards of American excellence. But Kendricks never looked at what people showed. He looked at where they hid. He traced Damon's email signature across forums and cross-referenced metadata from old public records. Eventually, it led him to a private domain, a shadow account under the alias Civic Stone. The profile was active. Just last week, it had posted a grainy photo of a black woman in a pantsuit walking through a luxury store with the caption, "Another one trying to play rich. They walk like they own the place but give it 2 blocks and they're back on food stamps." Kendricks leaned back in his chair. Not shocked. Just disappointed. He clicked further. The account had nearly 600 posts across fringe forums, masked as community watch groups, but steeped in racial contempt. Mocked shoppers. Shared blurry images of customers. One video recorded from a low angle showed a confrontation between a Latino father and a security guard with a title that read, "Guess who forgot how to follow the rules?" The comments were worse than the posts. Upvotes from other burner profiles, some with badge icons. This wasn't a lone hater. It was a network. He started downloading everything. Screenshots, IP logs, cross-post histories. He didn't just want evidence, he wanted proof of pattern. Because that's what always made the difference. One incident could be spun, but a series that told a story, and Kendricks was a master storyteller, just not the kind that needed cameras. By midnight, he had 3 folders on his drive. Folder 1, Damon Riker, Plaza Behavior Patterns. Folder 2, Online Activity, Racial Hostility. Folder 3, Sentry Corp Internal Memo Leaks. It was the 3rd folder that made his stomach tighten. He found it by accident, buried in a batch of training videos hosted on an outdated Vimeo backend. The video was marked Orientation Walkthrough, 2021. But midway through, one of the supervisors casually joked off camera, "We just remind the boys to keep an extra eye on the shoppers who think the rules don't apply to them. You know, the usual suspects." No one laughed, but no one corrected him either. It was the kind of quiet confirmation that made Kendricks sit back, take a breath, and type a new note to himself. This goes beyond Damon. He paused to sip his coffee, black, bitter, half cold, and stared at the composite file he was building. Ariel had said dig, but don't disturb. He understood now. She didn't want a mess. She wanted a case. Something bulletproof. Something that couldn't be denied, spun or buried. And he was getting close. But there was one more layer. Kendricks dug deeper, tracing Damon's online activity to an encrypted email handle linked to a now-defunct registration for a charity golf tournament in Greystone County, an event sponsored surprisingly by a known PAC with ties to historical anti-diversity campaigns. That handle led to one more burner account, this one even more subtle, registered under the name Echo First, hosted on an obscure messaging board reserved for ex-military and private security. Here the language wasn't blunt racism. It was code. Post read, "They're soft targets until the lawsuits start flying. Know who you're dealing with before you engage. The suits walk in proud, but it's all fluff. Remember your tier. Authority first. Apology never." It was all hidden beneath the language of policy enforcement and safety. But Kendricks had seen this structure before. It was the exact framework used in systemic redlining tactics, security justification memos, and bias in training programs that never intended to change, just to document and deny. He'd found what Ariel was looking for. By dawn, he uploaded the complete dossier to her encrypted folder, each file labeled, cross-referenced, and indexed. Evidence, commentary, background on the firms, behavioral patterns, quotes, IP confirmations, and the smoking gun, a series of overlapping logins that placed Damon Riker behind not just the profiles, but also the posting schedule, all while clocked in under Sentry Corp's payroll. He attached one final note at the top of the document. Recommend. Full board exposure. Optional. Selective leak. Required internal review pattern shows corporate awareness. Then he sat back, letting the quiet return. The city outside his loft was beginning to stir. Taxi brakes, delivery trucks, the clink of cafe tables being set. But in here, in the space where truths were pulled from shadows and turned into weapons, Kendricks had already done the day's most important work. Ariel received the dossier before breakfast. She didn't flinch, didn't react, just nodded once as she skimmed through the files. She read everything with the cold clarity of someone who already knew what she'd find, but needed confirmation before taking the next step. This wasn't just about Damon anymore. This was about the structure that had let him exist unchecked. The plaza's negligence. The hiring process designed to overlook rather than investigate. A system that didn't just enable people like Damon, it positioned them, and Ariel now held the blueprint of that structure in her hands. Across the city, in his crisp uniform, Damon stood at the same post. Oblivious, still greeting customers with that hollow efficiency. Still scanning, still assuming no one had seen through him. Still thinking he'd won the moment, because no one had raised a voice. But the thing about silence, it listens, it watches, and sometimes, it prepares. It was 2:03 a.m. when Kendricks Voss cracked the final gate. The main security feed for Marcel Plaza had already given him more than enough to validate Ariel's instincts. But something hadn't sat right. The timestamps, the angle, the metadata on the footage that captured Damon Riker's interaction with Ariel had a sharp clinical edge, almost too precise. Clean cuts, compressed data where there should have been motion blur. If you weren't trained to notice, you'd miss it. But Kendricks noticed. He always did. Most retail centers operated with layered security, live feeds, backup cloud servers, and the forgotten local cache, the off-grid storage no one checked unless something catastrophic happened. And that's where Kendricks went next. Tunneling into a digital closet hidden behind a junk IP and mislabeled archives, he found it, archived feed marked Service Duct Cam B3, not even labeled as main entrance footage, and yet there it was, a second view of Ariel's arrival, lower angle, slower frame rate, raw and untouched, and it told a very different story. From this angle, you could see Damon before he stepped into frame. He didn't approach them like the official version suggested. He watched them, for at least 15 seconds before making his move. Noticing Ariel, then hesitating. His posture shifted. His mouth moved, muttering to himself. Then he squared his stance and advanced. Not like a guard doing a sweep, but like someone prepping for confrontation. Kendricks's jaw set as he scrolled frame by frame. At 11:42:07, Damon stepped into Ariel's path, but it was what happened at 11:42:13 that changed everything. On the main feed, the footage skipped forward 6 seconds, just a jump small enough to be written off as signal lag. But here in the raw dump, Kendricks watched those 6 seconds unfold. In those seconds, Damon smirked, and he said something. No mic picked it up, but lip reading was a skill Kendricks had taught himself out of necessity. He rewound, slowed it, zoomed in. You people never know where the line is. Not ma'am, not sorry, you people. Kendricks felt heat climb into his neck, but he didn't stop. At 11:42:21, Damon reached subtly for his radio, not to report anything, but to kill his mic. On the main feed, that action was cropped. On this one it was plain. This wasn't just targeted behavior, it was premeditated control. Damon knew what the cameras could see, and more importantly, what they couldn't. But that wasn't the worst of it. Over the next 2 hours of raw archived footage, Kendricks unearthed 4 more interactions from the last month. All followed the same structure. All involved black women entering the plaza alone, or with partners. Each time, Damon delayed, questioned, stalled. One woman was asked for a preferred shopper code, a policy that didn't even exist. Another had her bag flagged, and was walked back to her car, only to return moments later with a manager who smoothed it over. None of it was aggressive. None of it screamed racism, but it whispered it loud enough. The pattern was surgical, controlled, deliberate. Worse still, Kendricks found logs indicating manual editing of security footage. From those days, entries made by a user ID, attached to a system admin no longer with the company, which meant one of two things. Either Damon had access he wasn't supposed to have, or someone else was covering for him. Kendricks compiled it all. The raw footage, the timeline, the transcript, a folder of comparison screenshots between edited and unedited files. The lip-read transcript. He created a silent audit trail of corruption embedded in institutional normalcy. And he sent it. Not to Ariel this time. He sent it to Shaq. Not with a subject line. Not with a message. Just the files. It was 3:11 a.m. when Shaq opened them. He sat alone in his den, wrapped in a sweatshirt that still smelled faintly of the cologne Ariel had spritzed on his chest hours earlier. The lights were low, only the soft ambient blue of his monitor lighting up the room. His fingers tapped slowly against the desk as the first video played, frame by frame, angle by angle, word by unspeakable word. At first he didn't move, didn't blink. His massive shoulders were still, his back straight, face unreadable. But as the pattern revealed itself, as the truth embedded in the silence between actions started to scream, his breath shifted, not louder, not quicker, just heavier. This wasn't just what happened to Ariel. This was what had always been happening, and would continue to happen to others, unless someone stopped it at the root. He clenched his hands slowly, not into fists, into holds, as if trying to compress every part of his body that wanted to shatter something. Because for a man his size, rage had always been a loaded question. The world never gave him the right to be visibly angry. Not without consequence. Not without cost. That was the cruelest part of it. The bigger he got, the smaller his room for emotion became. But now the evidence gave him something else. Permission. Not for vengeance. For action. He picked up his phone. Opened a note. Typed out 4 names. People he trusted. Quiet allies in positions of influence. Then he deleted the list. Not yet. The moment wasn't ripe. He clicked on a second clip. Another woman. Another encounter. Damon at the entrance. The audio barely present, but the tension unmistakable. You didn't need words to hear intent. And Shaq remembered a night from years ago, fresh out of college, walking Ariel to her car after a gala. A police cruiser slowed beside them. The officer didn't roll down the window, didn't ask questions, just stared. Ariel had turned her face to the side, letting her hair fall over her profile. Shaq had squeezed her hand once. He thought that moment was behind them. But some ghosts don't age. They just change uniforms. Now, sitting in his home, surrounded by achievements, awards, a legacy carved in both hardwood and hard truths, Shaq realized something he hadn't wanted to admit. Fame doesn't insulate you from the sickness if the system still sees your skin before your soul. He opened the final file, a comparison chart, created by Kendricks. Left column footage that had been edited. Right column, what really happened. One line at the bottom stuck out, burned into the page like an indictment. Selective memory is still deception. Shaq stood slowly, walked to the edge of the room, looked out the window, city lights blinking like static across the horizon. He said nothing, because words were too small for this. But the silence, his silence was no longer just quiet. It was movement. The first phase of something larger. Because what they didn't see on camera wasn't just Damon's actions. It was the cost of looking away. The conference room on the top floor of the Marcel Plaza executive suite was everything Ariel expected it to be. Cold in temperature, polished in presentation, and hollow in soul. Walls made of smoked glass, a table long enough to seat the egos of 12 men, and lighting that felt surgical in its intention. Not a single portrait hung, just abstract art, curated ambiguity, to match the personalities of the men who used this room to make decisions with ripple effects most never saw. Ariel stood at the head of the table. She hadn't been announced. She hadn't scheduled the meeting through formal channels. There was no agenda attached, no assistant running slides, no PR firm pulling strings. She had simply arrived. A quiet call to the plaza's legal counsel had been all it took. Her presence did the rest. Her name still had currency here. Deep generational currency. She wasn't a guest. She was part of the original architecture, and those who remembered knew better than to test her reason for showing up without warning. The men seated before her were exactly the type of people who like to control outcomes before the question had even been asked. 5 board members. All white. All middle-aged. All in tailored suits with very expensive watches and very limited expressions. They shifted in their seats as she placed a slim black folder on the table. Nothing dramatic. No thud. No tension. Just placement. Precision. She didn't sit. She didn't need to. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she pressed her finger against the tablet embedded in the folder, and opened a secure file. The screen illuminated, displaying the first video clip Kendricks had compiled, The unedited footage from entrance B, Damon Riker. The smirk. The words. The manipulation of radio audio. Ariel stepped back, folded her hands lightly in front of her waist, still silent. The men watched. At first some of them leaned back, expecting another vague HR incident they could contain with a few phrases like internal review or employee reassignment. But the further the footage played, the more still they became. One of them, a man named Carson Dre, cleared his throat, but didn't follow with words. Another, Michael Traynor, crossed his arms too tightly, as if bracing against something colder than the air conditioning. Next came the cross-cut comparisons. Real footage. Edited footage. Then the pattern. 4 women. 4 interactions. 4 subtle acts of obstruction. Their expressions. Their body language. Their silence in the face of microaggressions that had been camouflaged into procedural tone. It was damning, but not in volume. In clarity. There was no drama here. Just data. And intent. Then, the final segment. The social account connections. Damon's burner posts. His pattern of language. His fixation with shoppers of color. The comments. The screenshots. The overlay of shift schedules and timestamps from Plaza entry logs that placed him on site for each incident. No one said a word. They didn't need to. Because Ariel had brought more than evidence. She had brought something they weren't prepared to confront. Accountability that didn't ask for permission. She reached into her coat pocket and placed a sealed envelope beside the tablet. It contained a printed list, names of attorneys, media contacts, and DEI consultants. The implication wasn't loud, but it was absolute. This was going to be cleaned up. Properly. Quietly. Permanently. And if it wasn't, there would be no press conference. No lawsuits. Just a strategic hemorrhaging of silence from the inside. Because Ariel knew how to crack foundations without ever lifting a hammer. Finally, Carson Dre leaned forward, hands folded like he was praying, though no one had ever seen him in church.
I assume this hasn't gone outside yet, he asked.
Ariel raised her chin by half an inch. That was her answer. He nodded. Slowly. I'll call a closed board vote, he said. She didn't acknowledge it. She didn't thank him. Because this wasn't a favor. This was a correction. Michael spoke next. We'd need a legal buffer if this reaches Sentinel. He's technically under their umbrella. Ariel's gaze locked onto him like she was drawing a bead, steady and clean. She didn't blink. Then change the umbrella, she said. It was the only sentence she spoke in that entire room. And it landed with more force than anything shouted ever could. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. By its end, Damon Riker's name had been deleted from the digital roster. His access codes were deactivated. His termination processed under Clause 12B, gross misconduct, behavior unbecoming of client standards. No payout, no appeal, no courtesy calls. He didn't find out in the office. He found out at his apartment when his access card failed to unlock the parking garage. He called his supervisor. The line redirected. A robotic voice told him his employment had been ended. No elaboration. Just gone. The plaza made no announcement. No internal memo. No email thread of canned statements. There was nothing for the public to react to, because the matter never needed to be public. Ariel had seen to that. She didn't believe in spectacle, only in precision. If justice was a needle, she was the hand that threaded it, and stitched the wound shut without leaving a scar. Outside, the city continued. Pedestrians walked past the storefronts without ever knowing the war that had been won quietly above their heads. Ariel stepped into the lobby, not hurried, not triumphant, just anchored, the kind of woman who knew exactly how deeply her influence ran. She passed through the entrance where it had all begun, the same archway where Damon had once tried to test her presence. Now his absence echoed louder than his words ever had. She didn't stop, didn't glance, just walked on. Shaq was waiting outside the plaza, leaning against the SUV. He saw her exit. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't need to. She gave a soft nod, and for the first time in days, he exhaled.
They got in the car
and drove on. No horns, no headlines, just resolution, just silent. But the kind of silence that tells you everything. For a moment, it seemed like silence had done its job. Damon Riker was gone. His name scrubbed from the Marcel Plaza's employee roster, his access revoked, his position unfilled. There was no official announcement, no public explanation, no ripple effect outside of those who'd been close enough to the truth to recognize its quiet correction. Ariel had done what she always did. Surgical, swift, effective. But Damon was never the kind to leave quietly. 2 weeks later, in the early hours of a Monday, a headline dropped. It wasn't on a major outlet. Not yet. It landed on a second-tier, gossip-heavy digital platform with a reputation for controversy and traffic-driven spin. Security guard cancelled by elites for doing his job. Damon Riker speaks out. The article was full of Damon's carefully curated narrative. A photograph of him in uniform, arms folded, cropped just right. The lighting made him look like a working-class martyr. He claimed he'd been following protocol. That Ariel O'Neill, wife of wealthy celebrity Shaquille O'Neal, had refused to comply with standard ID policy, and that he was targeted by a coordinated effort to have him removed. He called it reverse discrimination. He claimed his life was being destroyed by a system catering to political correctness and racial sensitivity. He spoke about being doxxed, about private investigators digging into his life, and how he was smeared across corporate channels for doing what he was trained to do. He didn't name Ariel directly, but he didn't need to. The dog whistles were loud enough to echo. By noon, 3 more sites had picked up the story. Conservative talk shows ran with it. Phrases like overreach of woke elites, cancel culture strikes again, and another good man torn down by racial politics saturated the headlines. Damon had rewritten himself as the victim, and the internet ate it up. For Shaq, the day moved in slow motion. He sat in his office, phone buzzing every 5 minutes with calls from PR reps, media consultants, even corporate sponsors. Do we respond? Do we sue for defamation? Do we issue a counterstatement? Shaq said nothing. He didn't touch his phone, didn't open his laptop. He sat with his back to the window, staring at the wall, shoulders quiet, breath even. He knew this game. He knew how quickly facts became fog in the hands of people who didn't want truth. Damon had triggered something deeper than a media moment. He'd tapped into the reservoir of resentment that always existed beneath progress, the kind that didn't want to listen, just to lash out. By evening, justice for Damon was trending. It was calculated. He knew that. He'd seen the playbook too many times. But what no one saw coming, what not even Ariel anticipated, was the voice that would finally respond. Lucille O'Neill. She hadn't spoken publicly in nearly 5 years. Not since her last national interview where she discussed parenting, philanthropy, and her son's rise to fame. She'd always chosen quiet grace over attention. But some things, she believed, needed a mother's hand. That night, without alerting PR teams or clearing it through agents, she sent a 2,000-word op-ed to the Tribune, one of the most respected editorial platforms in the country. It ran at 6:00 a.m. the next morning, under a simple headline, "My son has carried the weight of your gaze. Let me set down the truth." Lucille O'Neill. The piece was a masterclass in tone. She didn't attack Damon. She didn't even name him. She didn't raise her voice through the page. Instead, she began with a story. A story about walking into a store with her son when he was 15. How the clerk followed them silently, asked Shaq if he needed help before he'd even picked up an item. How Shaq had looked at her, confused, and she'd simply told him, "You were seen before you spoke. That's the way of it, baby." She wrote about teaching her son that dignity sometimes means swallowing what should have been spit out. That silence isn't surrender, it's self-preservation. That blackness in America came with an extra code of conduct, no handbook. She wrote about Ariel, how she was grace under fire, how being a black woman in wealth didn't protect her from being scrutinized like a trespasser in the very places her tax dollars helped build. She wrote about the legacy of quietly dismantling disrespect, about the exhaustion of always being expected to understand while being denied the same understanding. Then, midway through the op-ed, she pivoted. "Let me be clear," she wrote. "My son did not raise his voice. My daughter-in-law did not curse, scream, or threaten. They did what we've always taught our children to do: remain calm, document, and seek justice through structure, not spectacle." She detailed the pattern Kendricks had uncovered. Not with videos, but with words that painted every line vividly. The surveillance tampering, the racial profiling, the silence of the Plaza's leadership, until accountability arrived, dressed in power they couldn't dismiss. And finally, she addressed the firestorm Damon had ignited. There are those who believe being held accountable is the same as being attacked. There are those who mistake exposure for oppression. And there are those who will always find a way to center themselves in a story that was never about them to begin with. She ended the op-ed not with condemnation, but with clarity. We do not seek your sympathy. We do not need your applause. We ask only that you recognize the dignity we extend, even in the face of disrespect, and that the next time you hear a story that starts with a raised voice, you ask who was quiet first. The piece went viral in less than an hour. By noon, it had been quoted by every major network. Journalists, politicians, celebrities shared it not as a soundbite, but as scripture. It wasn't reactionary. It was reflective. And in a moment where noise had drowned the truth, Lucille O'Neill's voice sliced through like a cello in a storm. Damon's support began to fracture. The platforms that had amplified his story began to hesitate. Questions arose about his past, his affiliations, his posts. Kendricks's cyber trail research found its way into the inboxes of investigative reporters. One of the sites that originally published Damon's claims pulled the article, citing new and evolving information. And just like that, the narrative shifted. Not because Shaq fought back. Not because Ariel demanded retraction. But because Lucille had done what only she could do, reclaimed the truth through the lens of history, humanity, and motherhood. Shaq didn't say anything publicly, even after that. He didn't have to. He visited his mother that afternoon, found her on the porch of her Florida home, sipping sweet tea like she hadn't just reset the nation's tone. "You wrote it better than I ever could have," he said. She smiled, eyes soft but steady. "I didn't write it for them, baby. I wrote it so you didn't have to." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that says everything words never will. And in that quiet, Shaq finally exhaled, not because the storm had passed, but because the air had changed. Damon faded from the headlines after that. He tried to claw back relevance, releasing a live stream, offering his side again. But no one was listening anymore. The noise he'd tried to make was no match for the presence Lucille had commanded. And in that presence, the world remembered something important. Sometimes the loudest truths are delivered in the quietest tones. The glass gleamed brighter than usual. The morning Marcel Plaza reopened, under its revised guidelines. It wasn't that the windows had been cleaned better, or the floors buffed with more polish. It was the air lighter, but more aware, like the entire building had absorbed what happened weeks ago, and was now exhaling with cautious intention. There were new signs at every entrance. Subtle, modern, but unmistakable. Not warnings, not disclaimers, just reminders. All guests are welcome. All guests will be respected. Presence is not to be policed. It is to be protected. The statement had been crafted by a new department formed in direct response to the scandal. Diversity and Integrity Oversight, funded in part by a discreet but generous donation from the O'Neills. No plaque bore their names. That was never the point. Inside, everything looked the same on the surface. The same designer storefronts, the same tailored shoppers, the same curated ambiance. But something had shifted under the glass. The security teams were new. Not in faces, many had remained, but in focus. Training had changed. Not just procedural training, but something deeper. They were taught about gaze, tone, proximity, how authority carried weight differently, depending on who wielded it and who it landed on. It wasn't just about learning how to protect anymore. It was about learning how to see. That initiative came from Shaq directly. He'd launched a program quietly, without cameras, that partnered with local security firms and vocational schools. It was called Watchman Legacy. The goal wasn't just to retrain guards. It was to mentor them. Educate them about presence, about power, about what it meant to be a gatekeeper, and not a gate. The first cohort included 17 young men and women, most from underserved communities. Some former offenders trying to find footing again. Others just eager for a path that meant something. Shaq met with each one personally. Not for optics, for accountability. He told them stories, not about fame, or basketball, or celebrity. He told them about Newark, about the time he was 16 and mistaken for a suspect in his own neighborhood, because he matched a description, about how Lucille made him walk the long way home. After that, not because she feared for his safety, but because she didn't want him to become angry without aim. He never raised his voice during those sessions. He just let them listen. Let them feel the weight of what it meant to carry authority with grace. Ariel, on the other hand, returned to the plaza only once after the changes were implemented. She didn't walk in with security or fanfare. She wore all black, her hair up, sunglasses low. She moved through the space like she always had. Elegant, assured, but now every glance in her direction wasn't just admiration. It was recognition. People remembered. Not just the incident, but the response. The silence. The precision. The justice delivered without theatrics. Some staff members lowered their eyes out of discomfort. Not shame. Exactly. Just the acknowledgement of witnessing something they hadn't known how to name at the time. Others greeted her with measured respect. Not performative. She didn't stay long. A quick stop at Maison Thorn. A soft thank you to the manager who had quietly filed a complaint on her behalf in the weeks after the incident. Then she left. No interviews. No statements. Just present. Kendricks was gone by then. Disappeared back into the digital shadows where he thrived. He never stuck around for applause. His role was to surface truths, not sit in their aftermath. But his fingerprints remained. The plaza's internal systems had been rebuilt from the ground up. Firewall protections against footage tampering. Multi-level accountability for incident logs. AI-assisted behavior pattern tracking that flagged unusual gatekeeping behavior. Kendricks had designed the framework, then vanished. He'd already moved on to the next assignment. That was his rhythm. Strike, secure, disappear. Lucille never made another public statement. She didn't need to. The op-ed had become a fixture in academic discussions, cultural think pieces, even orientation modules at several corporate DEI workshops. Universities invited her to speak. She declined them all. Her work was never meant for podiums. It was meant for preservation. And the crowd, that silent assembly of witnesses who had stood frozen the day Damon Riker tried to reduce a woman like Ariel into a moment. They remembered. Some of them had watched the fallout with discomfort. Others had shared articles, replayed footage, whispered regrets. A few had even written anonymous letters to the plaza board, expressing what they felt too small to say aloud that day. The echo of that moment hadn't just left a mark. It had reorganized the room. It was the kind of shift that didn't scream change, but cultivated it. Small things changed first. Employees stopped assuming. Managers started asking better questions. Staff meetings began with culture checks. Phrases like read the room were replaced with understand the weight. Diversity hires became standard. But more importantly, so did empowerment hires. And Ariel? She remained as she always was, unbothered but watchful. She didn't relish in the result. She wasn't fueled by bitterness. She had long ago mastered the art of detachment from external validation. What mattered to her was not that people saw what happened, but that they understood it, that they didn't wait for a headline next time to stand with the one being questioned. She often said, "I don't want apologies. I want adjustments." And now, she had them. In small ways, but real ones. The plaza's new motto, etched into the stone at its main entrance, read simply, "Respect is not a request, it is the foundation." People paused when they read it. Some nodded. Others smiled faintly, because they remembered. The sun hung low over the edge of the city skyline, bleeding amber into the cracked concrete of a weathered basketball court, nestled between two housing complexes on the west side of Glenvale. The chain-link fence surrounding the court buzzed faintly with the hum of summer. Pigeons skirted the rooftops. Sneakers scuffed rhythmically across the faded paint. And at the center of it all, standing just behind the half-court line in an old hoodie and shorts, was Shaquille O'Neal. He wasn't Big Shaq out here. Not the NBA legend. Not the millionaire. Not the philanthropist. Out here he was just Coach Shaq. 6 feet and 11 inches of steady presence, holding a basketball in one hand, and listening with the full weight of who he was. The kids called him Coach Q. No one remembered who started it. It stuck because it fit. Short, strong, familiar. He came out twice a week without fail. No cameras, no speeches, just practice. Some days they ran drills. Other days they just talked. Today had started slow. A few missed free throws. A few lazy passes. A couple of kids more interested in their phones than in ball. Then, midway through a water break, a boy named Corey looked up at him from the bench. Corey was 12. Thin frame. Fast feet. Bright, restless eyes. The kind of kid who watched the world like he was still trying to decide if it deserved his full trust. "Coach Q," he said, wiping sweat off his chin with the bottom of his shirt. "Why didn't you yell at that security guy? The one who disrespected your wife?" The other kids turned slowly. They'd heard about it. Not from the news. From whispers. From reposted videos. From older brothers and sisters who'd told them bits and pieces. They didn't fully understand the story, but they understood disrespect. They knew what it looked like, what it felt like, what it meant when someone looked at you like you didn't belong. Shaq crouched down in front of Corey. rested the ball on the black top between them. His smile came slowly, wide, warm, but with a quiet edge of something else underneath. Not sadness exactly, something heavier. Because not every fight needs noise to win, he said. The kids waited, expecting more, hoping for a story, a breakdown, a lesson wrapped in something they could post later. But that was all he said. Shaq stood up again and bounced the ball once. The sound echoed across the court, hollow and clean. The moment passed, but not really. It settled. They went back to playing, but the rhythm was different. Sharper, more connected. No one spoke of it again. But something in them had shifted, like the ground had adjusted beneath their feet, just enough for them to notice balance mattered. Later that evening, after the last kid had been picked up and the sun had dipped below the horizon, Shaq sat alone on the same bench. The court was quiet now, just a few leaves tumbling in the breeze. A bottle left behind, the echoes of laughter still clinging to the metal of the fence. He looked out over the space, his body still, his breath steady. The world had moved on from the Damon Riker story. News cycles had spun. Social feeds had refocused. The plaza now buzzed with new energy, new slogans, new hires. But Shaq had never been interested in optics. He didn't care about trending hashtags. He cared about moments like that one with Corey. Real moments. Unpolished. Unscripted. Seeded with truth. He thought about Ariel. About how she had carried herself through the storm. About how she never once asked for applause. Just impact. About the way she'd looked at him that night, after Lucille's op-ed had gone viral, and said, "You didn't need to fight for me, you just needed to stand with me." He remembered that line like it was stitched into the lining of his soul. Lucille had called him the morning after the op-ed dropped. She didn't speak like a mother looking for praise. She spoke like a woman who had finally put words to a weight she'd carried too long. "You ever notice," she'd said, "that we do all this fighting, but the real win is when they finally listen, and not just hear?" He had nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I didn't raise you to roar," she'd continued. "I raised you to resonate." And he had. He thought of Kendrick's somewhere out there now, behind another screen, in another city, unpacking another story most people would never realize needed unpacking. Kendrick's never wanted the light. He wanted leverage, to lift the truths others buried in plain sight. Shaq picked up the ball again and turned it in his hands slowly, like he was smoothing a thought. He knew that the world didn't change all at once, that sometimes it shifted in inches, in the way a young security guard now paused before demanding proof of belonging, in the way a wealthy shopper stopped assuming their presence exempted them from responsibility, in the way a mother's words outlived the fury of a false headline. The camera didn't need to pan in for a dramatic closing. It could rise slowly now, over the court, over the trees, catching Shaq sitting quietly, a single man in a wide space, holding a ball not to play but to remind himself that control doesn't always come from domination. Sometimes it comes from stillness. In a world that expected him to react, he had chosen to respond, and that made all the difference. He looked up at the sky, now deep indigo, and pulsing with city haze. Then he stood and walked away. No fire, no fireworks, just dignity and echo. If this story stirred something in you, it's because you've seen it happen. Maybe to you, maybe to someone you love. Keep your eyes open. Stay louder than silence, even when you choose not to speak. Stories like this don't end. They ripple. Be part of where they land next. Because the next time dignity is tested, the response might come from you.